Welcome back. You're watching this CNBC Africa special, which focuses on South Africa's National Development Plan. Still with me in the studio, of course, is Minister Trevor Manuel, Minister in the Presidency responsible for the National Planning Commission. Professor Raymond Parsons, he's the Special Policy Advisor to Business Unity South Africa, and of course the President of COSATU, Sdumo, Dlamini. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Of course, you've had your say for those who've been with us since the beginning of the program. We're now going to be giving an opportunity to the audience to put some questions. Professor Jan Kruger from UNISA, you have the floor.
I have a serious concern. Minister Manuel, you mentioned the ideal of 6%. As things are going at the moment, every year our schools produce another batch of unemployable youth. We have graduates that they graduate but they have no skills. I encounter graduates that are quantitatively illiterate. How can we ever get to a 6% unemployment? The structural unemployment sounds an unsurmountable problem.
Minister Manuel.
Thank you.
Well, it's what we start. I mean, you know, I think that when one looks at labor market issues, we don't work with what we wish we had. We have to work with what we have, and part of what we have, and your analysis, Prof, reflects on what is weak in the schooling system. And the proposals on education deal with precisely that. We must secure commitment to teachers who will be reskilled, for oversight and accountability to communities, for measurement through annual national assessments, grades 3, 6, and 9, not waiting for grade 12, and ensuring that not just the language skills but also the quantitative skills are developed, and they need to be developed early in life. If we don't do that, it's not just the absence of jobs, it's also the cleavage between the children of the rich and children of the poor. That's what we have to focus on. That's why education is so important in the plan, not just chapter 3 that deals with the economy, but also the education issues.
All right, can we take the second question from the lady at the back?
It's Vanita Govender, Public Sector Standard Bank. Minister Manuel, in my engagement with the public sector executives, I noticed that there are many people in acting roles, and we know what happens in acting roles, that decisions don't really happen quick enough. As a result, my concern is that we have a problem when it comes to delivery because of that. So is there any rule or act that's going to go in place where we can have maybe a 2-year term before senior executives move between that, so you can actually see some accountability and some delivery?
Well, the changes that Minister Sisulu is introducing in the public service are actually focused on that. There is actually a lot of pressure also on confirming appointments and dealing with the vacancy rate. You'll know that the Auditor General publishes the vacancy rate by department, and that vacancy rate is not just against need, it's also against departmental design. So it's work in progress, but sometimes, and in some departments, securing the necessary skills, especially competing with the private sector, is incredibly difficult, but it's work in progress. But once senior managers, directors general and deputies have been through the interviewing process, it gets to cabinet and their position is confirmed. There are a few vacancies, but it's on a declining scale.
Okay, can we have the third question? The gentleman here in front, the blue with the blue. Yes, this one. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Dr. Alan Feldman. I teach leadership at the Graduate School of Business Leadership. One of the core issue in leadership is trust. And out there, as we watch the media and all the information we're getting, trust levels are low. And if I may speak to labor and business and government, we just seem to see that there's no consensus on the way forward. On the 10th of May, we would have of 2034, we would have been through this process for 40 years, which is a magical biblical figure. Barack Obama came to power after 40 years after Dr. King died. And we're looking forward to that. On that day, as Minister Manuel pointed out, the central thing is the lives of people. How is the life of my grandson going to be? So, for COSATU, I want to ask, this is a critical question. Can you see that an agreement like the Environmental Kyoto Agreement or CODESA Agreement can be reached with the private sector and government, and to say, yes, we will make the trade-offs so that we can reach that day of redemption?
Mr. Dlamini.
Indeed, it's a critical question, but it should be asked with an understanding that when you then deal with issues, you're not just going to act as if they are not there. Can I just remind you, for the early part of our democracy, at least for 10 years, we have been saying, and Trevor Manuel was the Minister of Finance then, and the President of the country would have been saying, the fundamentals are in place. You remember that language. Fundamentals are in place. Gear came in. Fundamentals are in place. Why I'm raising that issue? Because you're saying then we should find consensus points, which I support, and I fully agree with you. We have found consensus in a number of other issues, but there are vast differences on a number of other issues. The elephant in the room, which is the point I wanted to make, our strategy, macroeconomic strategy, will always be an elephant in the room because it gets us to operate from different angles. We have to confront that debate in our country. Then we'll be able to address the questions Professor Kruger has just raised. We'll be able to address the aspirations of the NDP. We'll be able to address the aspirations of all societies in our country. It may not be the panacea to all our problems because we need to continue mobilizing society behind a plan. We should be able to agree on a plan. I've said earlier on, COSATU's approach has not been rejectionist to the NDP, but we didn't wholly embrace. We have opened and agreed to the space that has been opened to say it's not a cast in stone policy. Let's engage in it. We're entering that space now.
I just want to say that I think one of the worst legacies of apartheid was the lack of trust that it generated, and of course that has a huge history. Because low trust in any society, in any economy, is like a tax on all economic activity, and it means you can't translate what you want into action because you are being, in fact, disrupted and being challenged in the roots of a lack of trust. But from a business point of view, and I think that's accepted, that trust is, I mean, you can't have a sort of magic wand and say from tomorrow there'll be trust. You work at problems, and as you find solutions, you begin to show that there's trust. And we think that certainly the National Development Plan is an opportunity to rebuild trust, not to keep saying it's a problem, but to begin by its implementation to then create trust and show we can have a shared vision, we can have differences of opinion, but we have a common goal because we believe that's now overriding given the urgency of the priorities that are facing this country.
Do you agree?
I agree with the professor. Let me just go back. And I'd like to ask CNBC to host a discussion between Mr. Dlamini and I on macroeconomic policy.
We're always ready to take up that challenge.
Because the truth of the matter is macroeconomic policy doesn't create the employment. You need strong microeconomic policy. Now you can hope that you can grow in an environment of macroeconomic imbalances. There's been no country in the world. The Lula moment that COSATU has spoken of actually had stricter macroeconomic policy than South Africa ever had, even under GEAR. But let's focus on what we have right now. And right now, we have a country that is facing enormous challenges. We don't have savings. We have a high fiscal deficit. We have a high deficit on the current account of the balance of payments. Who's going to pay the bills, and how will we create the employment? That's the issue. And unless we are prepared to knuckle down and say, life is actually not perfect. It's not what we want. We don't start with what we'd like to have. We have to start with certain realities. And those realities are, in fact, what should drive our decision making. Our obligations not to ourselves, Our obligations are to the next generation.
Of course, Mr. Manuel, we will be taking up that challenge and we'll be speaking to the people who collate your diaries. We will want to have that debate. But let me give
Sdumo, are we on, my brother?
Most definitely.
Okay.
Okay,
good.
so we are going to be hosting that discussion, but let me throw the floor open to some more questions. The lady in front.
I first have to apologize. Instead of standing up, I'm feeling a little dizzy, but I
You
do
have
want
every right to
I
sit down.
do want to ask the question. My name is Shinyamisi Shemane Diseko. I'm actually the chairperson of SBL. The question that I have actually is, I want to refer it to the minister. This is with regards to an article that just came up, I think, in the paper recently, about junking of certain chapters within the NDP. And this particular issue is raised by Mr. Tony Leon, and saying that one of the chapters that were junked were chapters on international relations, and I can understand why that is a concern with him. My interpretation of the whole thing is that in this plan right up to 2013, there is a possibility that we could be junking certain chapters as we go along, now that this socio-economic plan is not perfect. Question that I have is, we actually at SBL as an institution, we are sitting with academics and we are sitting with a lot of brain power from our alumni, including our students. And because of that, what are the chances that we could look at them actually being part and parcel of the engine room in helping you iron some of the challenges that we are definitely going to be coming across before 2030? Thank you.
Let me deal with a number of points you've raised. The first is, and I want to repeat what I said. When somebody who is anonymous as a source steps out of line and says, this is what happened in the cabinet meeting, you can't confirm it, I can't confirm it, but a cabinet spokesperson can. Now, there's been no confirmation. I'm not prepared to elevate the words of a source spoken in the dead of night to a journalist, probably in a pub somewhere, to the level of an official statement, and I'll treat it with the disdain that it deserves. But I want to repeat the fact that what we've put on the table is far from perfect. We believe that taken together, it provides us with that route map to get to the destination. It's the route map analogy is also what the President used to describe the plan. But along the route, we are going to encounter that there are certain impediments, and all that we must do is have the humility to recognize that the objective is measured in the lives of the people. Progress is measured not in the words, but in the lives of people. And if that is the approach we take, we're going to pull this through. Because you can't have perfect vision. History is not preordained. History is not made in circumstances of your choice. History has to be made as we go along. We need information, and we need information sharing, and we need that commitment.
Okay, some other questions at the back, Natasha?
Natasha from the Business Day newspaper. There's a scheduled alliance summit between the African National Congress, the SACP, and COSATU next month, where the NDP is likely to be raised by the allies. Can we expect any changes thereafter, given that COSATU is already on record saying, its General Secretary said at the NUMSA Central Committee that it would be difficult to support, to convince workers to support the African National Congress in the 2014 election, given its support for the National Development Plan. What are your thoughts on that, Minister Manuel?
Natasha, I can only ask you, how long is a piece of string? Because you don't know what the issues are until you've sat down to discuss them. And for me, it's very important that we don't talk about slogans, we talk about implementation, and we talk about how you measure and where you measure change.
Can I
And
also
I'm saying it's not what happens at the child, in the life of a child at school like Rodin or St. John's, it's what's happening in the lives of children in township schools and in rural schools. It's that kind of measure we need in place.
Both the other panelists wanted to chip in, Sdumo?
Yeah, I wanted to say that, Natasha, recall that I said only last week has COSATU adopted its position on the NDP. And we shall be calling yourselves to elaborate on what is our position on the NDP. And having said so, we have said again that COSATU, from its 11th National Congress, has adopted or taken a resolution to put its weight behind an ANC election victory next year. So there is no ambiguity on those issues. When we persuade each other to engage orderly and more together on the NDP, the intention is exactly to do what Minister Manuel is appealing to all of us, to contribute to a progressive move forward.
If I could just add to that and to what Minister Manuel said earlier, it's quite correct. Slogans don't bake bread and they don't create jobs. And that's the message we must take away. And the important point here is, yes, there has to be debate, but we've had nearly 20 years of debate. Now, a big component must be translated into action. And deeds will speak, to use the cliche, much louder than words. And I think that's the threshold where we are now. Yes, we'll have to get past the election and all sorts of things might happen. But the important thing is that out of Mangaung and out of the election must come a strong mandate that this is the broad road we're going to walk, and we're all going to try and walk it together.
Okay, shall we take some more questions from the floor? Who's got the mic? Oh, lady in front, sorry.
Barbara Wood, Woodlands Media and PMR Magazine. I would like to address sustainability, because it's one thing to create artificial jobs. In Europe, they've done, for example, €1 jobs. Those are not sustainable. They do not eliminate poverty. And I'm also not saying that it's ideal just to create decent jobs short term. But what about sustainability of jobs? Internationally, there is the trend to have short-term contractual jobs. Those do not create social adherence and social security. People who are in short-term contractual jobs cannot create a pension fund, cannot have a medical aid fund. That means sooner or later they fall out of the net, they come out of a contract and are unemployed again. So they're never properly employed, and that lack of sustainability creates uncertainty as well in the country. So yes, short term you can fix figures and you can create certain percentages, but long term it's misleading, and the fiber in the country is at risk.
Mr. Manuel, I think that question ought to be answered by you.
Look, I mean, the challenge is, of course, that we're talking of a global situation. You're looking at a country like the United States, where the real wages of blue-collar workers now is lower than what it was 30 years ago. You're looking at the situation in Europe, country by country. You're looking at the situation across all of Asia. And of course, South Africa would be no exception. But if we don't even have a starting point to try and understand what is happening in the labor market, we will never get to that point. And I agree with you entirely. I agree with you that certainty in the lives of all of us is fundamentally important. It's like Raymond Parsons was talking about, the certainty that investors want. I think certainty in the lives of all of us is fundamentally important. These are the issues we must talk about, and that's what ultimately sustainability is about. But if we don't even afford ourselves the chance in a rational way to sit down and persuade and be persuaded, I don't think we have a starting point to get there. That's the tragedy.
No questions from the floor. Okay, let's revert to the panel. Mr. Dlamini, the question of certainty, both from a perspective of investors and of course also ordinary South Africans, many of them your members, about how they're going to be able to not just take care of themselves but also of course of their families. What are the trade-offs that COSATU is prepared to accept. We, for example, are in the phase where the National Assembly is discussing the question of labour brokers, for example, a very contentious issue that speaks directly to the nature of work and the quality of jobs, and of course also impacts on central bargaining. Is COSATU having a non-negotiable position on labour brokers?
On the total ban, it's a non-negotiable, but on the need to ensure that we can create sustainable jobs, we are on the platform. We are open to the point that was made earlier, I think, by the lady who behind there, also substantiated in many times by Minister Manuel, of the role of the public servants and the whole notion of service delivery, quality service delivery, fighting corruption. We have to deal with those, and workers must play their part on those. We have to deal with violent strikes in our country. We have to deal with the negativity that is portrayed throughout by ourselves and other people. We have to fix those issues in our country.
Professor Parsons, we're running out of time. I'm going to give you the second last word. Negativity, a lot of negativity from the South African private sector, afraid to invest, allegations that you're hoarding money in banks instead of putting it into the economy.
Well, I think the point here is that what business wants in order to boost its confidence and confidence in the future of the country is this plan must become the new normal. We must now accept it. We must be prepared to challenge aspects of it, but broadly it's the way we want to go. And we mustn't underestimate the challenge, because if you look at some of the global performances, there's a handful of countries, a handful, that have been able to sustain high growth over a long period. So we mustn't underestimate the challenge, nor do we feel that we must act in such a way as to say, well, it's the world that perhaps owes us something. We're going to have to be competitive. We're going to have to carve out a bigger share of trade and investment, but above all, mobilize this to the bigger goals of 2030. And so really, I think the emphasis now must be to collaborate, to make a success of what we want to see in this country over the next 16 or 17 years.
Minister, I'm going to give you the final word. We are having an election in less than 10 months. We're talking about putting a plan on the table that will have broad consensus that everyone must buy into. But of course, elections are also about getting people to vote for certain parties. To what extent is the election going to impede very honest discussion among the alliance partners on what is negotiable and what is non-negotiable? And at what point is the government prepared to say, we are going to lead, we are not going to be led by our alliance partners?
I think the first point to make about the plan, and was articulated by the President when he gave the Planning Commission its mandate, was if you look out to 2030, you'll cover a number of electoral cycles, so don't be held in check by the next election. There are issues that we will be dealing with across the period, and that's what we must retain the focus on. Unfortunately, there are going to be those kinds of issues. There's a lot of political point scoring and hard-headed bargaining, brinkmanship, and grandstanding as you approach an election. But this is why we must be resolute about how we work through these problems. We must recognize what the nature of the challenge is. But more importantly, I think as a nation, one of the issues we must get right is the links between the present and the future. It's that notion of gratification. There's too much emphasis on instant gratification. It's this realization from the past. In Sandton, there are very wealthy people, so everybody wants to live like Sandton, but it's not going to be there. How do we construct the link between the present and the future? And that comprises a series of trade-offs, and that's what we must be willing to talk about, because if we don't do that, we will fail the next generation. We might do very well for a short time, but we will fail the next generation. And that, I think, is a sacrifice that we must not ever make. We're standing on the shoulders of too many people, Too many lives have been lost to bring us to this point. We must never be forgetful of that, so that we always look to the future and ask what decisions we take now that make provision for the next generation to come through and to have better lives than what we've had.
Well, on that note is where we will have to end it. Thank you so much to, of course, the panel, Minister Manuel, Professor Parsons, and of course also President of COSATU, Sdumo Dlamini, and a big thanks to our audience. Until next time, from me, Karima Brown, it's goodbye. Thank you for joining us. Do stay tuned to CNBC Africa.